All right, thanks everyone. Welcome back. Hope you were able to, run to the kitchen and get a snack. And it is my pleasure to welcome Grant Schneider to the floor. Grant and I have intersected in multiple ways in multiple different jobs, both of us moving around from government to the private sector. But I've always had a great deal of respect for Grant's capabilities and what he has done, both when he was at from places like DIA to the Office of Management and Budget, worked with me on the National Security Council, and now in the private sector. So Grant is going to talk to us today about the state of federal cybersecurity, a passion of his, and I will turn the floor over to Grant. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Really great to be here, and thanks to everyone for participating. I think it's been a great, great event thus far, and I think we've got hopefully, a great program for the rest of the afternoon as well. Those of you who were hoping to see Chris Krebs, I'm not Chris Krebs. Fully recognize that. I do want to put a shout out to Chris, though. Chris and I had a great partnership for all the time that we overlapped in government, and really, one of the things that I was proud of walking out of government is the increased relationship and partnership we had between the Office of Management and Budget and with the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. I think that partnership got a lot tighter, and I think being able to work with Chris, work with Brian Ware, and really set some foundations that hopefully the next folks that walk into our jobs will be able to just really continue forward and double down on. Chris and I also worked together when I was at the National Security Council, and really I think had some great outcomes around enhancing protections to critical infrastructure. Obviously, everything he's done recently in this round of the elections, but also the 2018 elections, other aspects of critical infrastructure, and then also that partnership and being able to help secure the federal space. And one thing we've seen a lot of and heard a lot of both this morning and yesterday has been around the importance of partnerships, right? Chairwoman Underwood kicked us off yesterday, was very focused on how can we partner? How can she help from a congressional standpoint? And we know the partnership with Congress is really important to get things done and to achieve the tasks that we want to achieve. Ann Neuberger yesterday talked about NSA, and really her objective with the Cybersecurity Directorate there to be more of a partner with both federal civilian agencies. I saw that firsthand as we worked issues when I was in government, but also to be able to be a partner with the private sector as well. We've seen a lot more transparency from NSA, trying to put out more alerts. We also heard about that, the need for partnerships this morning from Marina, the need for international partnerships. I think I can speak for a lot of the folks here, Marina, and let you know that we are looking forward to being a partner and really partnering with like-minded countries around cybersecurity and how can we make better strides. And then the last panel around cybercrime, also something that requires partnerships and public-private partnerships. And it is really true that we throw that word around a lot. And I think Michael Daniel mentioned in the last panel, it's kind of like information sharing, right? It's become a concept, and public-private partnership have become a concept, and it doesn't always have enough depth and enough meaning behind those. And I think it's really paramount that when we talk about partnerships, that we do figure out what is most critical and what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve, and kind of what is everyone's roles. And that's when, in my mind, the partnerships are A, most valuable, and B, just most successful. And by having a clear set of expectations, I think it really pushes us forward to people know what one another are going to do in the partnership. And so historically, about 140 years ago, today, there was a partnership. It actually started a couple months before this, but went into place, and it was all of the railroad operators in North America, so in the US and Canada, and they got together and created time zones, right? So today, literally at noon today, all the station clocks got reset to create time zones across the US and Canada to facilitate travel on railways, because railways were able to move products and services and people a whole lot faster. And of course, time zones are so important to us. The one benefit that we've had with the pandemic is that this event has been able to be international and global on scale. And the coordination of that, of course, all happens with our watches and our timekeepers. And an interesting thing about time zones, in my opinion, is that it actually took 35 years for Congress to catch up, and for Congress to actually weigh in and institutionalize, if you will, or codify in 1918 the concept of time zones. And that was really because there was World War I and they wanted to implement daylight savings time to gain efficiencies for the country. But I use that as an example because A, it happened today, and the fact that there was clarity of roles and expectations, and railway operators were competitors, right? They wanted to compete with one another. However, this was an opportunity for them to really come together, to create a partnership, and to focus on some achievable outcomes. And that is something that I think we've also seen for the last few years around cybersecurity. And there's more to do, and I'm not at all saying there isn't more to do. But when we talk about cybersecurity and kind of what hasn't gotten done in the last few years, and specifically around federal agencies, but even nationally, right? We've had a national cyber strategy. There is Executive Order 13800 around critical infrastructure and federal cybersecurity that really kicked off a whole bunch of partnerships and a whole bunch of reports, some of which got actioned on better than others, right? Some of them probably became a little more shelfware than anyone would have liked. At the same time, in the federal space, we've seen just a number of policy updates during the last 4 or 5 years around identity management, around high value assets, around cloud and moving from cloud first to cloud smart, around a federal data strategy, most recently here in September around vulnerabilities disclosure programs and processes and putting those in place. And one of the things that we really focused on while I was in government was for all of those federal policies as they came out. OMB policies need to be at a relatively high level by nature, but to be able to enhance those with amplifying guidance from CISA, and amplifying guidance in a couple different forms, right? I should also mention the trusted internet connection policy, because that was one that had a lot of guidance that then came out as well from CISA. And sometimes that guidance with the VDP, vulnerability disclosure programs, was in the form of a binding operational directive. Sometimes it was just reports or data or some mandates from CISA, a little less binding, but guidance to agencies on more specific timelines, and more specific, the guidance from DHS was able to get a little more nuanced, but they were things that we worked collaboratively. We worked them before the policies went out so that they could come out together and really start to pull federal agencies together. And I think federal agencies and the state of federal cybersecurity is in a really good place. I think over the last things we've done really over this administration, over the previous administration, set agencies up to be able to respond to the national pandemic, right? We all know, and we're still continuing to live it because we're all here in our basements or wherever we might happen to be for this event. But everyone shifted to near full-time, near complete telework, and agencies weren't prepared to do that in advance. I think when we talked to agencies right after we went into the pandemic and the telework ramp up was starting, there were 1 or 2 agencies that had done some pretty good stress tests of kind of testing 60, 70, maybe % of their workforce doing telework. There were other agencies that kind of figured they tested their telework capabilities every Friday when the building was mostly empty and most people were teleworking, a little less scientific, but also valuable data. In general, though, agencies were able to turn to. They had basic capabilities that were in place, and they were able to create the partnerships, right, through partnerships with private industry. These weren't things that happened overnight. It took lots of partnerships with industry for agencies to be able to, ramp up where they needed to be ramp up. There were definitely some agencies that struggled. There were some lessons learned, but by and large, the flexibility, I think, that people had started to build into their technology and their technology programs, really paid off for being able to drive that forward. And so I think, from a cybersecurity standpoint, when we look at agencies, more agencies are able to manage their risks than they have been in the past. We've really, in the last few years, agencies have been very focused on the risk cybersecurity framework. We have used that, or OMB has used that now as a tool for a number of years. It's how the annual FISMA report is structured, and it is how we've worked with the inspectors general, and it's how the IGs are holding agencies accountable for the maturity of their programs. And the value in that, I think, is really important. The value in that is that a lot of those reports and assessments now are far more accessible for senior leadership, right? Senior leadership, and I think this was talked about earlier on the cybercrime panel. You don't expect senior leadership. I think Kristen said, you don't expect all the CEOs to be excellent in or experts in accounting, but you hire accountants. We don't expect them to be experts in cybersecurity. We expect them to hire cybersecurity experts. However, they need to have an understanding and awareness around all those areas, right? And they need to be able to engage their accountants, their human capital officers, their acquisition folks, their cybersecurity folks. They need to be able to interface with them and engage and be able to ask meaningful questions. And all of those meaningful questions, in my opinion, really go back to risk, right? Risk management for the organization, about how they are able to continue to deliver on their agency objectives and the mission requirements for the agency, and what are the risks that cyber vulnerabilities are bringing into that? What are the options when it comes to mitigating those vulnerabilities? Do agencies have a really good handle of the level of risk they're operating at? And then on top of that, as you do that from an agency by agency evaluation, and you understand high value assets, and you understand better, what's most critical to you, does the federal government have an appropriate picture of an enterprise-wide risk perspective? And that was something Executive Order 13800 mandated that OMB perform an enterprise risk assessment. While I was in the government, we rolled that into the annual FISMA report, but that started to take that more enterprise view, right? Which is really something, and we talk about being, only as strong as the weakest link, and the fact that we're all interconnected, and we are. And so understanding from an enterprise, how are different agencies making different risk determinations? How are they at least doing that based on similar criteria so that the assessments are similar? And what does that picture start to look like? And really, this is all to help leadership make some decisions, right? To help leadership make informed decisions about the operations and priorities and budget perspectives for their agencies. I think that's going to continue going forward into the new administration. I certainly think as part of the transition, you will see a significant amount of questions, at least I hope you're going to see a lot of questions from transition teams about cyber and about cyber risk, and exactly where our agencies operating, so that they really understand what it is when senior leadership comes in, what they're inheriting, and what that space starts to look like. So I think there's 3 areas that will get a lot of focus in the next administration going forward. They've all gotten focus in the current administration, and really in previous administrations. And I should say, having been in government in the Obama administration, literally had a front row seat to the transition to the Trump administration. We had a lot of consistency around cyber policy and cyber priorities. Some things changed a little bit, some things were rebranded. I would say the Trump administration looked at it a lot more through a lens of IT modernization and modernizing tools and capabilities and systems and delivery of digital services. And so cyber was rolled up under there in the Obama administration. I think it was a little more explicitly, focused post OPM, right, on cybersecurity. However, there weren't big shifts or changes in direction. And so I think we're going to see some continuation of that. I also think the president's management agenda that has gotten a lot of attention and a lot of focus on in the Trump administration, I predict that will continue to be a tool that gets used in a Biden administration, and that a big piece of that will continue to be around cybersecurity. And so 3 things that I think we're going to continue to see focus on. First is a continued focus around shared services. The last couple administrations have had a focus on shared services. I expect that the Biden administration will, and that will include cybersecurity shared services, right? It'll be broader than cybersecurity. It'll certainly include cybersecurity. And so we and the Trump administration, CISA was designated, DHS CISA was designated as a service provider for cybersecurity and to be a quality shared management organization. And what those are, what the QSMOs are, is not necessarily the service provider, but to create a marketplace that may have some government providers, may have commercial providers, may have kind of some hybrid, something that's sponsored by a government entity and really run and operated by a commercial entity, but really to create a marketplace to set standards and to start to treat federal agencies as really the customers that they are in that space, and really be able to provide services. Probably initially, I think, to a lot of agencies that maybe don't have the resources, don't have the capabilities to do some of those and provide some of those services on their own. Second area I think we're going to see a lot of focus on is data level protections. I think the data strategy, the focus on things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, wanting to share more data appropriately, and you can call focus on data protections, zero trust is certainly a big aspect of that or an element of it. But how are we protecting data at the data level as opposed to at the network level, which is something I think we've gotten better at, but we continue to still focus at the data level. I think there will continue to be perimeters in general, and I think we're going to need to protect those appropriately, but I think we're going to really need to double down, and I would recommend a lot of focus on the idea of data and how are you protecting data, both from all aspects of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? It's not just about can you keep data from leaving your environment, or can you keep it from being valuable if it leaves your environment? It's also around those that are inside your environment, insider threat, being able to understand, it feels like we live and work in a more divisive country, than ever. And so that pours over to our workforces. And so what are we doing from an insider threat? How do we know who inside our organization, trusted or not, we have to trust them to a degree, but we also have to understand what's happening in our system. So I think a big focus on data management and data security will come going forward. And then the third one I will mention is supply chain risk management, which we've seen a lot of action, both executive action, legislative action, regulatory action in the last few years, whether it's NDAA Section 889, the Secure Technologies Act that created the Federal Acquisition Security Council, the supply chain executive order. Granted, we haven't had any rules come out on that, but supply chain writ large, I think it's going to continue to be a focus area. I don't see it going away in a Biden administration. I think it's a place that we'll probably get more legislation on. I think we'll probably have some change, potentially some tweaking on the regulatory front and on the executive action front. But fundamentally, and I also would say, I think we'll likely see supply chain risk management less as a trade issue or being used as kind of a trade issue, and more hopefully just focused from a pure play security standpoint. But I think that's going to be a growth industry going forward, and we're going to need to have more consistency around what is a supply chain assessment, right? What does that risk assessment look like? Different organizations can make different risk determinations and what they're going to accept from a level of risk. However, we really need more consistency that if your industry and you're going through a CMMC assessment, that you have predictability and you understand what that is. If you are, going through one of the other executive actions, be it the bulk power EO, supply chain EO, or a Federal Acquisition Security Council assessment, that you really have some predictability of what that assessment's going to look like, and consistency that if you're having to go through 2 or 3 of those, that you're answering the same questions and they're being asked in the same context, or at least in similar context, and that you're not having to, drastically change your approach for each of those interactions with a different federal entity or organization in this space. So I think those are a couple of the places that we will see. I also think cybersecurity, I personally believe it's a bipartisan or nonpartisan endeavor, and I would like it to see it continue to be that, or maybe even be less partisan than it potentially has been, certainly the last few days. And because of that, certainly depending on what happens, finalizing in the House and the Senate, but if we do have a divided House and a Senate politically, I think cybersecurity is a place that people can come together. The cyberspace solarium has a lot of recommendations, some of which may get acted on in this Congress. Probably many of them will get pushed to the 117th Congress, and I think people will be looking for some opportunities to collaborate and work together. And this is really a ripe space to do that in. So, from state of federal cybersecurity, I think agencies are in a good place. There's always more work to do. There's more work to be done than really can. And so the ability for us, both inside of government and those of us outside of government, to be able to help prioritize and help put the focus on, how do we partner together to solve real problems, and how are we hopefully partnering together to solve future problems, as opposed to just reacting to yesterday's challenges, which we have to react to. But if we can get ahead of the curve, I think the partnerships are far more valuable, and that we can actually make far better strides going forward. So thank you, Michael. Really happy to be here. Happy to take some questions. If we have some, I guess I should have mentioned earlier, feel free to throw some questions out. I think we've got a couple more minutes before the luminaries panel.
Yep, we sure do. Thanks, Grant. I think that was a great summary of what's been going on in the federal space. One question that we did get from the audience relates to what does that enterprise approach that you were talking about that OMB was putting together? What does that look like? I'm going to be a little pejorative. I mean, is it just sort of taking the various agency reports and a big stapler and sort of stapling them together, or is it more like a DoD model? Can you give us a little bit of a flavor of what that actually looks like?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Michael, you certainly understand that asking OMB to do this sort of assessment is actually goes against OMB's DNA fundamentally, right? Because OMB is very much likes to kind of take and report on what agencies said, right? Agencies told us this, and this is what the agency said, and FSMA reports have really, been that for a lot of time. And I would say, this is an area where I think there is opportunity for OMB to really think through what is the role that they want to have in cybersecurity, and is it a role that is more I'm reporting on the reports and summarizing the reports, or I'm actually making an assessment and an evaluation, because what we've tended to do is hold people accountable to the reports that they give us, but we haven't largely questioned them. And I would say, this started to chip away at that a little bit. It's certainly not to the level of that if you were doing an independent risk assessment on a company or on a particular organization. It's not that level of robust. We certainly did some of those as deep dives, but they weren't done publicly, right? And the requirement for this was to do it at an enterprise level and to do it publicly. And so I would say candidly, it's something a little better than just stapling all the agency reports together and putting them in. It's not to the level that we probably really need it to be. And I think it's a growth opportunity going forward.
Yeah, and I think when you look at that space, right, the people talk about federal cybersecurity and the federal government as if it were a single thing, but you've got you've got everything from my favorite example, the Marine Mammal Commission, to giant departments and agencies with bureaus and people spread all over, not just the United States, but literally spread all over the world, right? And trying to do cybersecurity in that environment is incredibly challenging. I think one of the issues that we do run into, right, when we talk about this issue of federal cybersecurity, one of the reasons it's so important is that a lot of times the federal government is making recommendations to the private sector about what it should and should not do, and then the private sector turns around and says, "Yeah, but your cybersecurity is terrible. Why should we listen to you?" And so, how do you think some of the progress that we've been making, in federal cybersecurity can help deal with some of that criticism?
Yeah, I think it's. So I think 2 points on that. One is you mentioned, there is no such thing as just the federal government, right? It is a compilation of a whole bunch of organizations, a whole bunch of personalities, and we have agencies that do really, really well and are, quite frankly, better than probably a lot of commercial organizations, maybe even better than most commercial organizations. And we probably have some that are at the other end of the spectrum. And certainly, one of the things that came out of the National Cyber Strategy was the idea of having the federal government lead by example in this space, and lead by example from an accountability standpoint, and really be able to drive additional set the example, but set the example by holding ourselves accountable and really raise the bar internally. And so I think a lot of agencies have really done that. We've seen a number of incidents and vulnerabilities that have come out. And quite frankly, the government's done really well on patching. We've done really good on our DNS security, on DMARC security, on some things that we've picked up that, or we've recognized or fully embraced. If you set those as measures and targets, the agencies can turn to. And part of that, role, I think, of the leadership in this space is to be sure that we're setting targets that aren't just about compliance, but are actually about security. And when we do that, we end up having a lot of value there. The first binding operational directive was around patch requirements and patching critical vulnerabilities, and that's been updated, but it really drove down, it took a while. The government's not fast, but it took a while, but it truly over a year drove down from, most agencies having some critical vulnerabilities over 30 days old, and I don't remember the exact statistics, but down to less than 4 or 5 agencies ever having criticals on their internet facing that were over 30 days old. So if we can figure out the things to measure, I think the government can actually lead in this space, because the government can have a lot of agility when the government has the right incentives and the right pressure points.
And I think that's a really good point about a lot of it depends on what you measure. So getting that measurement right is another theme that I think we can all pull from a lot of the cybersecurity discussions. So Grant, thank you very much for pinch hitting today and filling in at the last moment. We very much appreciate that, and appreciate all your insights. And with that, I will turn the podium